Behind the glittering chandeliers of New York's Gilded Age, a young woman in pearls walked into a palace, but carried chains no one could see. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the dollar princess, was born into unimaginable wealth, yet sold into a marriage that made headlines around the world. To society, she was a crown jewel of an empire. To herself, she was a prisoner in satin gloves. This is not just a story of one heiress. It is a tale of an age built on fortunes and broken dreams, and the price women like Consuelo paid for palaces. The final decades of the 19th century in the United States were draped in gold and shadow, a period that would come to be remembered as a Gilded Age. On the surface, it was a time of extraordinary wealth, ambition, and display. The railroads stretched their steel arms across the continent. Industrialists built empires of steel, coal, and oil, and families whose names would become synonymous with excess emerged as new royalty in a republic that had once defined itself against aristocracy. Yet beneath the glittering facades of marble mansions and endless banquets, there was tension, struggle, and an insatiable hunger for legitimacy that money alone could not satisfy. Nowhere was this paradox more vivid than in the story of the Vanderbilt family. Rising from the docks of Staten Island through the relentless drive of Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, the family's fortune had swelled into hundreds of millions by the 1870s. His descendants inherited not only his wealth, but also the expectation to wield it as proof of dominance. Palatial homes rose on Fifth Avenue, each designed to outshine the last. By the 1890s, a visitor walking down Millionaires' Row in Manhattan could see entire city blocks transformed into monumental residences, castles imported into a young nation that had no dukes or princes of its own. But immense wealth alone could not purchase the one thing America's industrial elite longed for: social legitimacy on the world stage. The European aristocracy, with its ancient titles and centuries of tradition, regarded these nouveau riches with suspicion, even disdain. A duchess or marquis could trace their lineage back to medieval courts. A Vanderbilt could trace theirs only to a steamboat pier. For all their palaces, the American plutocrats were locked outside the gate of old-world respectability. This hunger for recognition birthed what newspapers of the time dubbed the era of the dollar princesses. The term referred to young American heiresses, dazzling with fortunes measured in millions, whose marriages became passports into European nobility. In exchange for enormous dowries, struggling dukes, counts, and princes offered ancient titles. It was a transaction cloaked in romance, but grounded in calculation. Europe's landed elites were often land-rich but cash-poor, their states sinking under weight of debt, while America's industrial titans possessed gold without heritage. The marriages fused the two, American dollars for European crowns. The Vanderbilts were among the most aggressive participants in this international market of status. Alva Vanderbilt, formidable matriarch and social strategist, built the family palace on Fifth Avenue so magnificent that even the heiresses, the reigning aristocracy of New York society, were forced to recognize her. Yet Alva was not satisfied with mere parties and rivalries. She envisioned her daughter, Consuelo, as a living bridge between two worlds, an embodiment of the Vanderbilt fortune draped in the legitimacy of European nobility. Consuelo's childhood unfolded within this gilded environment. Behind the towering walls of her family's Manhattan and Newport estates, she lived among frescoed ceilings, imported tapestries, and endless servants. To the outside world, Hayes was the epitome of privilege, dreamlike palaces where banquets never ended and jewels glistened under gaslight chandeliers. But within these golden cages, expectations were strict and freedom was scarce. Consuelo was trained not for personal happiness but for destiny. Every lesson in etiquette, every carefully orchestrated social debut, was part of a grander strategy. Her mother's vision was clear. Consuelo would not simply marry wealth. She would marry power, perhaps even a title. The Gilded Age was not only about individuals, but about spectacle itself. Families like the Vanderbilt stage masquerade balls so opulent that newspapers reported them as though they were national events. In 1883, Alva's infamous costume ball filled her mansion with thousands of guests, all glittering in diamonds and gowns imported from Paris, while the press gawked at the sheer extravagance. The price of admission was not merely wealth but relevance. Every chandelier, every gold-gilded chair was a statement that the Vanderbilts, once dismissed as rough-hewn traders, had now ascended to the pinnacle of American society. Yet, beneath the spectacle, shadows loomed. Workers who built the railroads and operated the factories labored in poverty while their employers danced in marble halls. Critics like Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner coined the very phrase Gilded Age to emphasize this contrast, a thin layer of gold covering a darker reality of inequality and corruption. For every mansion rising on Fifth Avenue, tenement slums multiplied across New York, housing immigrant families in conditions of deprivation unimaginable to the elite. In this sense, even the grandeur of the Vanderbilts was not free of moral weight. Their palaces symbolized triumph, but also provoked questions about the cost of such triumph. Consuelo's story begins in this tension-filled landscape. Born in 1877, she inherited not only immense wealth, but also the burden of representing her family's ambitions. Her very existence was tied to the larger phenomenon of the dollar princesses, young women whose marriages would stitch together the fortunes of America and the heritage of Europe. Though she could not have known it as a child, her future would be written not in the freedom to choose love, but in the relentless pursuit of status orchestrated by others. The gilded world around her dazzled with brilliance, but it was also a cage. From the moment she could walk, her movements were watched, her posture corrected, her future imagined not by her but for her. As the century neared its close, the glitter of the Gilded Age sparkled brighter than ever, yet its shadows deepened too. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, those shadows would soon become inescapable, shaping a life where dreams of freedom clashed against the weight of pearls and palaces. Consuelo Vanderbilt entered the world on March 2nd, 1877, at the very height of America's rise as an industrial giant. She was born into unimaginable wealth so vast that newspapers followed it breathlessly, while society whispered about it with envy and disdain. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was heir to a powerful share of the Vanderbilt Railroad empire, a business machine that had reshaped the American economy and made the family one of the richest in the nation. Her mother, Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, was no ordinary socialite. She was a woman of ambition and iron determination, someone who believed that money alone was not enough. Alva was set on shaping her daughter into a figure who would carry the Vanderbilts into the highest ranks of society, not only in America, but across the Atlantic. Consuelo's very birth was almost a public event. The Vanderbilt name filled the columns of New York's newspapers. Their palaces, their scandals, their extravagant parties, everything they did was news. To the public, the arrival of a new Vanderbilt heiress was another chapter in the ongoing story of America's most dazzling family. The world into which she was born was a world of staggering contrasts. On Fifth Avenue, America's wealthiest families built palaces inspired by French chateaux and Italian palazzos. Banquet halls sparkled with imported silver and crystal. But only a few blocks away, New York's tenements were overflowed with immigrant families who crowded into damp, airless rooms, working long hours for meager pay. This was a Gilded Age, an era of glittering luxury standing side by side with crushing poverty. Consuelo's childhood was shaped almost entirely by her mother's will. Alva Vanderbilt was relentless. She treated her daughter not just as a child, but as an investment, a carefully trained future duchess. Tutors, many of them European, were brought in to teach languages, music, history, and literature. Manners and refinement were drilled into her from the earliest age. Even her posture was corrected with rigid devices. Playfulness and childhood whimsy had little place in the Vanderbilt household. Consuelo would later remember the strictness of these years. While other children enjoyed games and freedom, she lived under constant discipline. It was a suffocating upbringing, but one that gave her resilience, strength she would one day need. The houses she grew up in reinforced this world of expectation. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was a towering French chateau dropped into Manhattan, filled with ballrooms, salons, and libraries that rivaled European palaces. Summers were spent in Newport, Rhode Island, at Marble House, an opulent seaside palace inspired by Versailles. These were not mere homes. They were monuments to Vanderbilt power. Every room, every corridor, reminded Consuelo of the grandeur she was expected to embody. She also witnessed her mother's battles for social recognition. In New York, the old guard families guarded their exclusivity fiercely. Alva fought her way into those circles, culminating in her triumph of 1883, a masquerade ball so spectacular that it forced Caroline Astor herself, the queen of New York society, to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. To Consuelo, these lessons were clear. Money could build palaces, but true power required persistence and strategy. At the same time, the wider world was full of unrest. Newspapers that chronicled Vanderbilt balls also reported on strikes, slums, and labor struggles. The contrasts of her age were everywhere, even if Consuelo herself was shielded from them. By her teenage years, she had become the very definition of the dollar princess. Tall, graceful, strikingly beautiful, she drew admiration wherever she went. Reporters detailed her gowns, her jewels, her every movement, but her beauty and charm were not hers to use freely. They were carefully managed by her mother, deployed to advance the Vanderbilt dynasty's ambitions. Suitors were evaluated not by affection, but by lineage, title, and the alliances they could bring. Consuelo lived in luxury that few could imagine. Servants at her call, wardrobes from Paris, glittering balls every season. Yet she was confined within a golden cage. Her choices were not her own. Every introduction, every smile, every dance carried expectations. By the 1890s, she was one of the most sought-after young women in the world. Society speculated endlessly which duke or prince would claim her hand. How large would her dowry be? What great alliance between America's money and Europe's aristocracy would her marriage represent? For Consuelo, this was not idle gossip. It was the architecture of her destiny. Her upbringing had prepared her perfectly for this role. The discipline, the education, the relentless grooming, all had been steps toward an inevitable path. She had become the very image of the Gilded Age paradox. A young woman of unimaginable wealth, celebrated for her beauty and elegance, yet with little freedom of her own. Consuelo Vanderbilt's birth gave her privilege beyond measure, but it also gave her a destiny she could not escape. The golden cage was set, and as she entered adulthood, the weight of that cage, the splendor, the expectation, and the sacrifice was about to define the rest of her life. Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt was not born into wealth, but she was born with ambition. From her earliest years in Mobile, Alabama, she displayed a determination that would later make her one of the most formidable figures of America's Gilded Age. By the time she married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, Alva had secured her place within the orbit of one of the richest families in the United States. But she was not content to simply enjoy the privileges of fortune. Alva possessed a vision that extended far beyond material wealth. She sought social supremacy, recognition, and the validation of old-world legitimacy. Her iron will would shape not only her own destiny, but that of her daughter, Consuelo, whose life became a stage for Alva's relentless ambitions. The Vanderbilt name carried money, but not respect. In the rigid world of New York society, the so-called 400 families, led by Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, dictated who was accepted into the highest echelons of social life. Despite their enormous fortune, the Vanderbilts were considered outsiders, descendants of a rough self-made steamboat magnate, not polished aristocrats with deep colonial roots. Alva resolved to change that. She saw herself as a general of a campaign, and her battlefield was Fifth Avenue. Every decision she made, from the houses she built to the events she staged, was part of a calculated war to force the Vanderbilts into society's inner circle. Her greatest weapon was architecture. Alva commissioned one of the most extravagant mansions of the era, a French Renaissance chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the mansion was not merely a home. It was a declaration of supremacy. It rose as a palace among palaces, with banquet halls, ballrooms, and facade that spoke of European grandeur transplanted into American soil. Yet a palace alone could not win the war. The doors of New York's social elite remained firmly shut. The heiresses and their circle continued to treat the Vanderbilts as parvenus, rich but unrefined. Alva's response was audacious. In 1883, she staged a masquerade ball so spectacular that it became one of the most famous events in American social history. Invitations were scarce, coveted, and deliberately withheld from anyone who refused to recognize her position. The ball cost an estimated $250,000, equivalent to millions today, and filled her mansion with over 1,000 guests dressed in elaborate costumes. Diamonds sparkled under chandeliers, orchestras played until dawn, and newspapers devoted pages to describing the excess. The coup de grace came when Mrs. Aestia, realizing that her daughter could not risk social exclusion, requested an invitation from Alva herself. With that gesture, the Vanderbilts broke through the gates of New York society. This triumph revealed the essence of Alva's will. She was not merely seeking acceptance, she was reshaping the rules of power. Through determination and spectacle, she had forced the old guard to bend. Her daughter Consuelo observed all of this closely. Even as a child, she could not miss the lesson. In Alva's world, willpower was destiny, and resistance was futile. Alva's ambitions, however, extended beyond New York. She understood that while she had conquered American society, true legitimacy lay across the Atlantic. The European aristocracy, despite its decaying finances, still held centuries of tradition and titles that American money could not buy outright. The marriages of wealthy American heiresses to titled Europeans had already begun, and Alva saw in this phenomenon an opportunity. Her daughter Consuelo would not merely be an ornament of New York. She would become a duchess, a symbol of transatlantic union between American wealth and European heritage. Consuelo's upbringing reflected this vision with unrelenting precision. Alva controlled her daughter's life with discipline bordering on tyranny. Every aspect of Consuelo's appearance, behavior, and education was orchestrated for a singular goal, to make her fit for a crown. Tutors drilled her in languages, music, and literature. Her posture was enforced with painful devices to ensure elegance. Social encounters were managed with strategic calculation. Consuelo was not raised as an individual. She was raised as an instrument of ambition. Behind this relentless drive lay Alva's own dissatisfaction. Her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt had brought her wealth but not happiness. William, though wealthy, lacked his wife's hunger for status and often indulged in leisure, gambling, and affairs. Alva grew increasingly frustrated, and her controlling nature intensified. In her daughter, she saw both a means to achieve what she herself had been denied and a chance to assert her dominance over a world that had once excluded her. Consuelo became both her project and her weapon. Alva's influence extended beyond the family sphere. She became a prominent figure in the women's rights movement, advocating for suffrage and social reform. Yet even in her activism, her iron will was evident. She approached the campaign for women's rights not with gentle persuasion, but with strategic force. She hosted lectures, funded organizations, and used her social clout to push for change. In this sense, Alva was a paradox, a woman who imposed strict control over her daughter's freedom while simultaneously fighting for the broader freedoms of women. Consuelo's adolescence unfolded under this complex shadow. She admired her mother's strength, but also felt crushed by her demands. Later in life, Consuelo would describe the pain of being forced into decisions she did not want, particularly regarding her marriage. But at the time, resistance seemed impossible. Alva's authority was absolute, and her daughter's role was clear. The Vanderbilt palaces, particularly Marble House in Newport, symbolized Alva's will in stone. Built as a gift from William for her 39th birthday, Marble House cost over $11 million, an astronomical sum at the time. Inspired by the Petit Trianon at Versailles, it was a monument to European grandeur and Alva's vision of herself as a modern-day queen of society. For Consuelo, Marble House was both a playground of splendor and a reminder of the weight of expectation. Every marble column, every gilded room reinforced the path her mother had laid out for her. By the 1890s, Alva's strategy was in full motion. Consuelo had blossomed into a beautiful, graceful young woman whose name appeared regularly in the society pages. Suitors emerged, but Alva dismissed them unless they carried titles worthy of her ambitions. She set her sights on the Duke of Marlborough, a man whose ancestral estate, Blenheim Palace, was as grand as any in England but whose finances were in ruin. For Alva, the match was perfect. Vanderbilt wealth would rescue Blenheim, and Consuelo would become a duchess. This plan revealed both the brilliance and the cruelty of Alva's will. She understood the exchange perfectly, American dollars for European crowns. But for Consuelo, it meant surrendering personal happiness for a role she did not choose. The iron will that had won battles against New York society was now turned inward, binding her daughter to a destiny of obligation. In the story of the Gilded Age, Alva Vanderbilt stands as a towering figure, a woman who forced her way into power through sheer determination. She reshaped the social order of her time and left monuments that still stand today. But her legacy is complicated. The same force that empowered her also constrained her daughter, shaping Consuelo's life into one of gilded sacrifice. As Consuelo approached adulthood, the lessons of her mother were etched into her very being. She had been trained to embody grace, wealth, and obedience, but beneath the polished surface lay a quiet resistance. Alva's iron will had constructed the cage, but it had also planted the seeds of a struggle that would define Consuelo's journey. The heiress was prepared for the crown, but the cost of wearing it would soon become painfully clear. For all the grandeur of Marble House and the endless glitter of Newport bowls, Consuelo Vanderbilt carried within her a secret sorrow. Behind her delicate smile and elegant bearing, she nurtured a tender heart that longed for freedom, warmth, and love unchained by ambition. It was this heart that led her into the shadows, into the forbidden comfort of a love her mother would never approve. Consuelo was still in her teens when her path crossed with that of Winthrop Rutherford, a tall, handsome gentleman of old American stock. Unlike the Vanderbilts, Rutherford's family boasted a pedigree stretching back to the early colonial days, a lineage that the most exclusive social circles revered. He was refined, charming, and unencumbered by the weight of broken fortunes. He belonged to the world of New York's inner sanctum, the very world Alva had fought to enter. Yet, paradoxically, Alva did not see him as worthy. For her daughter, only a European title would suffice. But Consuelo saw him differently. In Rutherford, she found not only a suitor but a confidant, a man who regarded her not as a pawn in social chess, but as a young woman with her own heart and mind. Their conversations flowed with ease, unburdened by ambition. He spoke to her not of power or position, but of gardens, music, poetry, and quiet joys. For a girl raised in the rigid grip of a mother's will, his presence felt like sunlight breaking through the heavy drapes of Marble House. Their affection grew in secret. They walked in shaded gardens, exchanged letters filled with longing, and dreamed of a future together. For the first time in her life, Consuelo allowed herself to imagine a destiny of her own choosing, not one scripted by her mother's iron hand. It was intoxicating, this taste of freedom, and terrifying, too. She knew well that Alva would never tolerate such a match. Alva had spent years preparing her daughter for a European crown. To marry Rutherford, no matter how respectable his name, would mean betraying everything her mother had built. Yet Consuelo's heart resisted reason. Love, once awakened, does not yield easily. The tension came to a breaking point when Alva discovered the romance. Accounts from Consuelo's later memoirs reveal the fury with which her mother reacted. Alva raged, cajoled, and threatened, wielding every tool of guilt and manipulation she possessed. She invoked duty, family honor, and even religion, painting Consuelo's affection for Rutherford as selfishness bordering on sin. In Alva's eyes, the young man represented not love but betrayal, the collapse of her carefully constructed empire. Consuelo pleaded, but Alva was relentless. To her, there was no compromise. Her daughter must marry the Duke of Marlborough, and no mere American gentleman, however pedigreed, could stand in the way. Alva even resorted to cruel tactics, once reportedly locking Consuelo in her room and declaring that she would never see her again if she disobeyed. For a young woman raised under her mother's unyielding authority, the threat was unbearable, and so the shadows closed in. Consuelo, though deeply in love, felt powerless against her mother's will. Her romance with Rutherford, tender and genuine though it was, became a casualty of ambition. In 1895, after months of resistance, she surrendered. She agreed to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a man she scarcely knew, but whose title promised a crown her mother so desperately desired. The announcement of the engagement stunned New York society. Newspapers gushed over the dollar princess, who would bring her fortune to one of England's most illustrious families. To the world, it was a fairy tale, the beautiful American heiress and the English duke. But to Consuelo, it was a shattering of her heart. In her memoirs, she later recalled walking down the aisle with tears streaming down her face, hidden beneath a bridal veil. Rutherford was not forgotten. Years later, long after her loveless marriage had crumbled, Consuelo would cross paths with him again. The affection they had once shared still flickered, a ghost of what might have been. But the choices forced upon her in youth could not be undone. The shadows of lost love remained with her, a reminder of the cost of her mother's iron will. For Alva, the marriage was a triumph. Her daughter was now a duchess, mistress of Blenheim Palace, bound to one of England's grandest names. Yet even in victory, Alva could not silence the whispers of what she had destroyed. Those who knew Consuelo saw the sadness in her eyes, the quiet resignation in her smile. The glittering crown concealed a broken heart. Love in the shadows is fragile, but it endures in memory. For Consuelo, Rutherford remained a symbol of the life she might have lived, a life of freedom, laughter, and genuine affection. Instead, she walked the path laid out for her, adorned with pearls and titles, but haunted by the shadow of a love sacrificed to ambition. The year was 1895, and the glittering facade of the Gilded Age was about to stage one of its grandest spectacles. In the vast drawing rooms of Newport and New York, whispers turned into headlines. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the beautiful daughter of Alva Vanderbilt, was to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. To the outside world, it was a fairy tale union, American wealth joining hands with British nobility. But beneath the silks, jewels, and society gossip, the truth was far more somber. For Consuelo, this was not a marriage of choice, but of coercion. By the late 19th century, the phenomenon of the dollar princess was at its peak. American heiresses, daughters of railroad magnates, steel tycoons, and banking giants, were being married off to European aristocrats in exchange for titles, prestige, and access to centuries of noble tradition. Their families provided the wealth to restore crumbling estates, while their new husbands conferred the glittering prize of nobility. It was, in many ways, a business transaction disguised as romance. And in this exchange, no deal was more symbolic than that of Consuelo and the Duke of Marlborough. The Duke, known to his intimates as Sonny, was no fairy tale prince. Born into one of Britain's most storied families, He was the heir to Blenheim Palace, a sprawling estate gifted to his ancestor, John Churchill, by Queen and in the early 18th century. But by the 1890s, the grandeur of Blenheim was decaying. The estate, though magnificent, was drowning in debt, its upkeep a burden the family could no longer sustain. For Sonny, marriage to a wealthy heiress was not just a convenience, it was a necessity. Consuelo, meanwhile, was being prepared for this role as if she were an offering at a royal altar. Her mother, Alva, orchestrated every detail. From the trousseau of gowns to the glittering jewels, from the invitations to the church arrangements, nothing was left to chance. The wedding would not only unite two families, it would cement Alva's lifelong quest for recognition in the highest social circles. For her, it was a culmination of years of ambition. But for Consuelo, the preparations were marked by dread. Her heart still belonged to Winthrop Rutherford, the man she had loved in secret. Even as dressmakers fitted her with lace and silks, even as carriages carried her to endless luncheons and rehearsals, she mourned the life she was being forced to abandon. Her memoirs, written decades later, reveal the depth of her despair. On the morning of her wedding, her eyes were swollen with tears. She was a bride adorned in jewels, yet chained by duty. The wedding itself, held at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York City, was one of the grandest spectacles the city had ever seen. Thousands gathered outside, pressing against barricades, eager to catch a glimpse of the American Duchess-to-be. Inside, the church glittered with floral arrangements, gilded decorations, and the luminaries of society. The Vanderbilt fortune was on full display, but so too was a hunger of the press and the public for the fairy tale of the age. Consuelo walked down the aisle, her gown a masterpiece of ivory satin, embroidered with pearls and delicate lace. A diamond tiara crowned her head, a symbol of the wealth that had bought her passage into English nobility. Yet beneath the veil, her face was streaked with tears. She later recalled that she wept openly as she made her way to the altar, her sorrow hidden only by the veil's delicate fabric. The Duke, standing at the altar, was handsome and imposing, but distant. He carried himself with the aloof pride of his station, and while he fulfilled the role of bridegroom with dignity, there was little tenderness in his demeanor. Their union was, from the very beginning, a transaction, his title for her fortune, her beauty and grace for his family's survival. The vows, spoken in solemn tones, carried the weight of tradition but little of love. After the ceremony, the newlyweds emerged to the roar of the crowd. The press declared it the wedding of the century. Headlines lauded the match as a triumph of wealth and nobility, a symbol of the merging worlds of American ambition and British tradition. Yet those who looked closely might have seen the sadness in Consuelo's eyes, the stiffness of her posture, the way her smile seemed more rehearsed and real. The marriage was followed by a lavish reception, where dignitaries, aristocrats, and New York's elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Toasts were made, music played, and champagne flowed. But for Consuelo, the night was hollow. She was now the Duchess of Marlborough, bound not by love but by duty, her fate sealed by her mother's relentless ambition. In the weeks that followed, Consuelo and the Duke departed for England. The voyage across the Atlantic marked not just a geographical crossing but an emotional one. As the shores of America faded behind her, Consuelo left behind the last remnants of her youthful freedom. Ahead lay Blenheim Palace, a place of grandeur, but also of confinement. In the British press, her arrival was greeted with fascination. She was hailed as the latest dollar princess, the American heiress who would save yet another struggling estate. The aristocracy, though wary of new money, welcomed her wealth with open arms. To them, she represented the salvation of one of their most iconic houses. To Consuelo, however, Blenheim would soon reveal itself as a gilded prison, where pearls and title could not mask the loneliness of an unchosen life. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough remains one of the most famous examples of the Gilded Age's transactional unions. It was celebrated as a triumph, yet it embodied the very contradictions of the era. opulence built upon sacrifice, prestige purchased with sorrow. It was a marriage not for love, but for a crown, and its cost would shape the rest of Consuelo's life. The Atlantic crossing that carried Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough to England in 1895 marked more than the beginning of married life. It was the end of Consuelo's girlhood and the silencing of her own will. What awaited her was not the fairy tale promised by newspapers, but a gilded prison built not of stone, but of tradition, expectation, and duty. From the moment she arrived in England, Consuelo found herself thrust into a world that was at once dazzling and suffocating. The British aristocracy welcomed her as a savior. Her dowry, an extraordinary sum estimated at several $1,000,000, would provide the means to restore the grandeur of Blenheim Palace, the Churchill family's ancestral seat. Yet while she was celebrated for her wealth and beauty, she was regarded less as a person and more as a symbol. The American bride who had rescued a dying dynasty. Blenheim itself loomed like a monument to this reality. Built in the early 18th century as a gift to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, it was not merely a home but a national landmark. Its vast halls, adorned with portraits, tapestries, and triumphal arches, told stories of war and glory. But to Consuelo, who had known the intimacy of gardens and whispered conversations with Winthrop Rutherford, the palace was cold and unyielding. Every corridor seemed to echo with the weight of history, every gilded ceiling another reminder of the role she was expected to play. Her husband, Charles Sonny Spencer Churchill, embodied this world. Though outwardly courteous, he was a man shaped by duty and pride. His primary concern was not companionship or affection, but the preservation of his title and estate. He had secured Consuelo not for love, but for her fortune. In her memoirs, Consuelo later described him as distant, controlling, and largely indifferent to her inner life. Their marriage, from its earliest days, lacked tenderness. The demands placed upon her were immediate. As the new Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo was expected to manage vast social responsibilities. She was to host dinners for dignitaries, attend royal functions, and embody the dignity of her station at every moment. She was surrounded by attendants and courtiers, yet often felt desperately alone. Her role was scripted, her every gesture scrutinized. Perhaps the heaviest burden was the expectation of heirs. Within months of her marriage, Consuelo understood that her primary duty was to produce sons who would secure the Marlborough line. By 1897, she had given birth to her first son, John Albert William Spencer Churchill, the future 10th Duke. A second son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, followed in 1898. To society, these births were triumphs, proof that the American Duchess had fulfilled her role. But to Consuelo, motherhood under such circumstances was shadowed by sorrow. Her children belonged as much to the family and estate as they did to her. Behind closed doors, her isolation deepened. The Duke's attentions were often directed elsewhere, and their relationship grew increasingly strained. Accounts suggest that he could be domineering, insisting on rigid adherence to tradition and his own authority. Consuelo's natural warmth and desire for freedom found little outlet within confines of Blenheim's walls. She turned, instead, to causes that gave her life a measure of purpose. Inspired by the social reforms of the late 19th century, Consuelo began to involve herself in charitable work, focusing particularly on education and health for the poor. She found solace in philanthropy, which allowed her to step outside the suffocating expectations of aristocratic society. In this wake, she discovered both her voice and a degree of independence. Yet even here, her efforts were often overshadowed by her role as Duchess, her personal convictions reduced to the polite pursuits expected of noble women. To the world beyond Blenheim, Consuelo was a picture of success, elegant, poised, and now mother to heirs. But those who looked closely saw signs of strain. Her slender frame and pale complexion were whispered about in society papers. Some speculated about her unhappiness, though such matters were rarely spoken of openly. Divorce was unthinkable in her position, and public duty demanded that she maintain the image of harmony. In her later writings, Consuelo reflected on these years with a mixture of sadness and resilience. She described how she felt trapped in a marriage that had never been hers to choose, bound by vows taken under pressure, and a life dictated by ambition not her own. The grand halls of Blenheim, admired by visitors for their beauty, were to her a reminder of captivity. She was a duchess, yes, but also a prisoner. The irony was bitter. The very crown her mother had fought so ruthlessly to secure became Consuelo's chain. Alva Vanderbilt had triumphed in her quest to see her daughter wed to a duke, yet the cost was Consuelo's happiness. The marriage that society hailed as the pinnacle of success was, in truth, a cautionary tale of what was lost when wealth and ambition overshadowed love. Still, Consuelo endured. Her quiet strength, her dedication to her children, and her growing involvement in charitable work sustained her. Though the walls of Blenheim confined her, they could not fully extinguish her spirit. The seeds of resistance, planted during her youth, remained dormant but alive. In time, they would grow into the resolve that led her to reclaim her life. For now, however, she was a Duchess of Marlborough, a figure admired and envied, yet silently aching. The wedding that had been celebrated as a crowning achievement of the Gilded Age had delivered her not into a kingdom of dreams, but into a prison of expectations, a prison where pearls were heavy, titles were hollow, and freedom was but a shadow. Blenheim Palace stood like a monument to triumph and tradition, its massive stone facade stretching across the Oxfordshire countryside, a reminder of Britain's military glory and aristocratic power. To visitors, it was breathtaking, a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, a national treasure, and the pride of the Churchill family. But for Consuelo Vanderbilt, the palace soon revealed itself as both a stage and a cage, a place where every step echoed with history, yet every day drained her freedom. When Consuelo first entered Blenheim as its new duchess, the scale of her new home was overwhelming. The great hall rose nearly 70 feet, its painted ceilings celebrating the victories of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Vast corridors stretched endlessly, lined with portraits of ancestors whose stern gazes seemed to measure her worth. The saloon, the staterooms, the long library, they were designed not for comfort but for grandeur. Even her private chambers, though furnished with luxury, felt impersonal and cold. She later described how the enormity of the palace emphasized her isolation, making her feel like a guest in a place where she was meant to reign. The Duke, proud of his ancestral inheritance, expected his young wife to embrace the role of mistress of Blenheim without hesitation. He saw in her the fortune that had secured the estate's future, and the beauty that lent new luster to his lineage. But he gave little thought to the emotional toll such a life demanded. Consuelo was expected to manage household affairs, oversee servants, and play hostess to a constant stream of visitors, politicians, royals, and aristocrats who came to admire Blenheim and its new duchess. Each gathering demanded perfection, gowns chosen with care, jewels displayed, etiquette observed without flaw. In these public roles, Consuelo excelled. Her natural grace and poise made her a favorite among many in society. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, admired her charm and wit. Queen Victoria herself acknowledged her dignity and beauty. Newspapers praised her elegance, often describing her as one of the most admired women of her generation. Yet the public image masked the private cost. Behind the smiles and glittering tiaras lay fatigue, loneliness, and a growing sense of entrapment. Daily life at Blenheim was marked by ritual and expectation. Mornings began with correspondence and household management. Afternoons brought hunts, luncheons, or charitable visits. Evenings were filled with dinners and formal receptions. For Consuelo, these endless duties left little room for individuality. Her every action was choreographed, her time consumed by obligations. Even leisure was prescribed: riding, music, embroidery, activities befitting a duchess but rarely of her own choosing. The Duke, meanwhile, grew increasingly distant. His focus lay on politics, estate affairs, and his own pursuits. He demanded obedience and adherence to tradition, often dismissing Consuelo's opinions. Their marriage, already fragile, became strained by his controlling nature and lack of affection. The bond that might have softened the hardships of aristocratic life never materialized. Amid this unhappiness, Consuelo sought solace where she could. Her children, John and Ivor, became her greatest comfort, though even in motherhood she faced limitations. Aristocratic custom dictated that the upbringing of heirs was largely overseen by governesses and tutors. Consuelo cherished her sons, but she often felt them slipping beyond her reach, raised more by tradition than by her embrace. It was in philanthropy that Consuelo found her truest escape. Inspired by the social reform movements of the time, she devoted herself to improving conditions for the poor. She supported schools, hospitals, and housing initiatives, often traveling beyond Blenheim's walls to meet those she sought to help. In these efforts, she discovered a sense of purpose that aristocratic society could not provide. Her compassion and energy made a real difference, earning her admiration far beyond the circles of wealth and privilege. Yet even this work was shadowed by her role. To many, her philanthropy was seen not as personal conviction, but as a fashionable duty of her rank. The Duchess of Marlborough could be charitable, yes, but always within the boundaries set by society. Still, Consuelo persevered, and in time, her work planted the seeds of independence that would one day guide her toward freedom. Visitors to Blenheim marveled at its splendor. They walked the great halls, dined beneath gilded ceilings, and strolled through gardens designed by Capability Brown. They saw in Consuelo the perfect duchess, radiant and composed, fulfilling her role with apparent ease. Few guessed the depth of her sorrow. Fewer still imagined that behind the grandeur, the Duchess dreamed not of titles or pearls, but of the simple joy she had once known in America, the warmth of a love freely chosen, the peace of a life unburdened by spectacle. The irony of her situation was sharp. Blenheim Palace, rescued by her dowry, stood as a monument to victory and endurance. Yet within its walls lived a woman who felt conquered, her spirit confined by the very grandeur that others admired. Life at Blenheim was a triumph for the Marlborough line, but for Consuelo it was another chapter in her story of sacrifice. Still, she endured. She played her part with grace, even as she grew increasingly aware of the gap between the life she lived and the life she longed for. Blenheim gave her titles, jewels, and recognition, but it denied her freedom. And in its endless halls and echoing chambers, she came to understand the true cost of a marriage made not for love, but for a crown. At Blenheim Palace, where every stone proclaimed the legacy of the Churchill line, Consuelo Vanderbilt lived under the long shadow of her husband, Charles Sonny Spencer Churchill, the ninth Duke of Marlborough. To the world outside, he was a figure of aristocratic dignity, a duke who had restored his ancestral state through his wealthy American bride. But within the walls of Blenheim, his shadow fell across every aspect of Consuelo's life, shaping her existence with cold authority and an absence of affection. The duke's character was rooted in duty and pride. Raised to see himself as the embodiment of an ancient lineage, he believed in tradition with an unyielding favor. The marriage to Consuelo was, for him, a practical arrangement, her fortune for his title, her beauty for his prestige. Love was irrelevant. Companionship was secondary. His concern was the survival of Blenheim, and in this he saw his young wife less as a partner and more as an instrument. From the earliest days of their marriage, the Duke asserted control. He dictated her role within the household, ensured her obedience to the rigid codes of aristocracy, and kept a careful distance that denied intimacy. To him, Consuelo was a duchess first and a woman second. The titles and expectations weighed heavily on her, and under his shadow, her individuality seemed to fade. Their relationship was further strained by his temperament. Account from contemporaries described Sonny as aloof, sometimes domineering, and often indifferent to his wife's feelings. He maintained the traditions of his class with a sternness that left little room for warmth. In public, He presented the image of a proud, composed nobleman. In private, his coldness reinforced Consuelo's isolation. The birth of her two sons, John in 1897 and Ivor in 1898, should have softened the distance between them, but even here, the Duke's shadow loomed. The children were heirs to the Marlborough name, and their upbringing was governed by custom. Consuelo loved her boys deeply, yet she was often separated from them by the dictates of aristocratic tradition. The Duke insisted that tutors and governesses oversee their education, limiting her influence as a mother. Even her relationship with her own children was mediated by his authority. Meanwhile, the Duke pursued his own interests. He involved himself in politics, serving in Parliament and cultivating ties with influential figures. He enjoyed the privileges of his station, including the admiration of society women who found his title and bearing attractive. Rumors of his affairs circulated in whispered tones, adding to Consuelo's sense of betrayal. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories underscore the imbalance of their marriage. The Duke enjoyed freedom, while his wife remained bound by duty. Consuelo, for her part, endured with quiet strength. She fulfilled her public role flawlessly, attending royal events, hosting dignitaries, and embodying the dignity expected of a duchess. Yet she confided in her memoirs that behind the polished exterior lay a woman deeply unhappy. She described the Duke's possessive authority, his emotional distance, and the way he treated her more as an ornament than a partner. "I existed," she later wrote, "but I did not live." At times, the Duke's shadow extended even into her philanthropic work. Though Consuelo found meaning in charitable efforts, supporting schools, hospitals, and housing reforms, the Duke viewed these activities with indifference or suspicion. He tolerated them only insofar as they enhanced the family's reputation. Genuine compassion mattered less to him than appearances. Consuelo's attempts at independence were often constrained by his disapproval. Their union became a portrait of contrast, the public facade of harmony, and the private reality of estrangement. At grand receptions, they stood side by side, the Duke and Duchess of one of Britain's greatest estates. Their images appeared in society papers, celebrated as a model of Anglo-American union. But in the solitude of Blenheim's halls, they lived as strangers, bound by contract rather than love. This imbalance took its toll on Consuelo's spirit. She suffered bouts of ill health, which contemporaries often attributed to her unhappiness. Friends and confidants noted her fragile appearance, her quiet demeanor, and the sadness that lingered in her eyes. The weight of her mother's ambitions and her husband's indifference bore heavily on her. Yet, even under the Duke's shadow, Consuelo's resilience endured. She continued to cultivate her intellect, her compassion, and her sense of justice. Though constrained, she began to envision a future beyond the gilded cage of Blenheim. The seeds of her eventual escape were planted in these years, nourished by the very oppression she endured. The Duke's shadow defined much of Consuelo's early life in England. It darkened her marriage, limited her freedom, and overshadowed her happiness. Yet it also sharpened her resolve. In the silence of Blenheim's great halls, beneath the weight of history and tradition, Consuelo came to understand not only the cost of her sacrifice, but also the necessity of reclaiming her own voice. In time, the shadow would lift. But for now, it loomed large, an emblem of a marriage that promised grandeur but delivered sorrow, a reminder that crowns and title could never replace love freely chosen. The pearls around Consuelo Vanderbilt's neck shimmered with brilliance, yet to her, they carried a heaviness no jeweler could measure. They were the emblems of her mother's ambition, the currency of her marriage, and the visible symbol of a gilded captivity. To the world, they spoke of privilege, status, and success. To Consuelo, they were a reminder of the price she had paid. Youth traded for duty, love sacrificed for obligation, and individuality surrendered for the preservation of dynasties. By the late 1890s and into the early years of the 20th century, Consuelo had become a fixture in British high society. She was admired not only for her beauty but also for her grace and composure. In portraits and at court functions, she embodied the very image of a duchess. Yet beneath the polished veneer, she carried a deep weariness. The pearls she wore so often became a metaphor for her existence, flawless on the surface, but strung together under pressure, each bead a fragment of sacrifice. The demands of her position grew relentless. At Blenheim, the daily rhythm of life was dictated by centuries of aristocratic tradition. Every meal was ceremonial, every guest list meticulously curated, every appearance a test of dignity. Consuelo presided over vast receptions, seated statesmen, royals, and diplomats at her table, and endured the constant scrutiny of both family and society. The Duchess's life was not her own, it was scripted by duty. Even her fashion choices spoke volumes. The jewels she wore, particularly her iconic pearls, were carefully selected to project stability and grandeur. They became part of her image, symbols of wealth that had saved the Marlborough estate. But while the world admired them, Consuelo could not escape the irony. Those pearls had been purchased with her freedom. They were, as she later reflected, chains more binding than iron. The strain extended beyond appearances. Her marriage to Sonny remained cold, and with each passing year, the emotional distance grew more apparent. While he pursued his interests, including politics and rumored liaisons, she found herself increasingly alone. The birth of her sons had given her moments of joy, but even motherhood was compromised by the rigid customs of aristocracy. Governesses and tutors overshadowed her presence, and the Duke's authority limited her role in shaping their upbringing. Isolation became her constant companion. Though surrounded by grandeur, Consuelo often felt imprisoned. Blenheim, with its majestic halls and sweeping grounds, was both palace and cage. Friends and confidants noted her melancholy, though she rarely spoke openly of her struggles. The weight she carried was invisible to most, yet overwhelming to her. Despite these hardships, Consuelo sought purpose. She devoted herself increasingly to philanthropy, finding in it an outlet for her compassion and a reprieve from her isolation. She supported educational initiatives, hospitals, and housing projects, particularly for impoverished women and children. Unlike the aristocratic duties she fulfilled for show, these causes reflected her genuine convictions. She longed to make a tangible difference, even as her own life remained constrained. Still, her independence was limited. The Duke tolerated her charitable work, but rarely encouraged it. To him, such endeavors were peripheral, acceptable only when they enhanced public perception of the family. Yet for Consuelo, philanthropy became a lifeline. In serving others, she reclaimed fragments of herself long buried under the weight of pearls and palaces. Society, however, remained blind to her unhappiness. To the outside world, Consuelo was a success story, the American heiress who had fulfilled her destiny. Newspapers celebrated her beauty, elegance, and role as duchess. Guests at Blenheim marveled at her composure. Few understood that beneath the surface lay a woman yearning for freedom, worn down by a life not of her choosing. In her memoirs, written decades later, Consuelo would look back on this period with striking honesty. She described her life as a duchess not in terms of glamour, but of sacrifice and sorrow. The pearls she once wore with pride became, in her reflections, a symbol of bondage. She admitted that her health suffered, her spirit weakened, and her youth passed in quiet despair. Yet she endured, carrying the weight with a dignity that concealed her inner struggles. The world around her was changing, too. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it shifting attitudes about women, marriage, and society. Suffrage movements gained momentum, and the rigid structures of the Gilded Age began to loosen. But within Blenheim, time seemed to stand still. Tradition remained unyielding, and Consuelo's life continued under the same heavy expectations. Her pearls remained ever present, a visual reminder of the bargain struck years earlier. They adorned her neck at royal courts, at dinners, at portraits that cemented her image in history. They symbolized wealth and success to others, but to her, they were the weight of sacrifice, a constant reminder of the cost of her gilded life. Yet even under this burden, Consuelo's strength deepened. The pearls did not break her, they shaped her resilience. The years she endured at Blenheim, bound by duty and overshadowed by Sunny, became the crucible in which a determination was forged. She began to see beyond the gilded facade, to imagine a life where her voice might matter. The weight of pearls was crushing, but it was also transformative. In their heaviness, Consuelo discovered her own strength. What had once been symbols of her captivity would, in time, become emblems of her survival. By the turn of the 20th century, the outward image of Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, remained impeccable. She was still admired as one of the great beauties of her age, photographed in elegant gowns, draped in pearls, and presented as a model of aristocratic grace. Yet beneath this exterior, something had begun to stir. After years of submission, sacrifice, and silence, Consuelo's voice, long muted under the demands of duty, slowly began to awaken. The awakening came not in sudden rebellion, but in quiet, determined steps. For too long, she had lived as a duchess in name only, a partner in a loveless marriage, and a prisoner of expectations. Yet Consuelo had always possessed a deep well of compassion and empathy, traits that set her apart from the rigid world of British aristocracy. These qualities found expression in her growing commitment to social causes. Her charitable interests became more than symbolic gestures. She immersed herself in work that sought to improve lives, particularly for women and children trapped in poverty. She supported schools, advocated for better housing, and gave her time to hospitals. In an age when the aristocracy often viewed philanthropy as a fashionable accessory, Consuelo's dedication carried authenticity. She was not content merely to lend her name. She engaged directly with the people she sought to help. This work gave her a sense of identity beyond her role as duchess. In moments of service, she was not defined by pearls, titles, or traditions. She was simply Consuelo, an American woman with a capacity to feel, to empathize, and to act. Her voice found strength in advocacy, and her compassion became a form of quiet defiance against the coldness of Blenheim. Her involvement with reformers and intellectuals further broadened her perspective. She came into contact with thinkers and activists who challenged traditional views on class, gender, and society. Through these interactions, Consuelo began to understand that her struggles, though gilded in wealth, were part of a larger story about women's rights and independence. She saw that her own silenced voice was linked to the silencing of countless others. The strain of her marriage, however, remained. Sunny, the Duke of Marlborough, remained indifferent to her awakening. He tolerated her philanthropic work, but did not encourage it. In his world, the Duchess's role was ceremonial, not transformative. Yet Consuelo pressed forward, finding in her causes both a refuge from loneliness and a platform for self-expression. At the same time, she began to carve out small spaces of independence within the confines of Blenheim. She traveled, often for her charitable engagements, and in these moments away from the Duke, she tasted freedom. She could speak her mind more freely, pursue her interests, and surround herself with people who valued her ideas rather than her title. Her awakening was also emotional. Though still bound by marriage, Consuelo's heart longed for connection. Over time, she formed relationships that provided the affection and respect denied to her within Blenheim. These bonds were discreet, but they offered her glimpses of what life could be if love and choice, rather than duty, guided her path. For Consuelo, the act of reclaiming her voice was gradual but profound. It did not come with loud declarations or open defiance, but with steady steps that affirmed her individuality. Each act of philanthropy, each intellectual conversation, each moment of independence chipped away at the silence imposed upon her. The world around her was also shifting. Women's suffrage movements gained momentum in Britain and America. Old hierarchies were being questioned, and the notion of a woman confined solely to marriage and motherhood was increasingly challenged. Consuelo, though still trapped in her aristocratic role, felt the pulse of these changes. She identified with them, even if she could not yet fully join their cause. Her awakening did not go unnoticed. Friends observed a new determination in her, a subtle but unmistakable shift in her demeanor. While she remained outwardly the perfect duchess, she carried within her a growing confidence, a readiness to reclaim her life. Yet the path forward would not be easy. The Duke's shadow still loomed, and the expectations of society remained heavy. But Consuelo had begun to see that her silence was no longer sustainable. She could not continue to live only as a symbol of wealth and prestige. Her voice demanded to be heard, her individuality acknowledged, her humanity recognized. In time, this awakening would lead her toward decisions that altered the course of her life. But in these years, it was enough that she had found within herself the strength to speak, to act, and to dream of freedom. The pearls still weighed on her neck, but their meaning was beginning to change. No longer symbols only of bondage, they became reminders of endurance. Each bead represented a step she had survived, a chapter she had endured, and a testament to her resilience. The voice that once lay hidden beneath their weight was rising, and with it, the possibility of a new life. Blenheim Palace had been built to symbolize permanence. Its stone walls, monumental columns, and sweeping gardens were designed to project power across centuries, a legacy of the Churchill line. To visitors, it seemed unshakable, an estate too grand, too historic to ever falter. But for Consuelo Vanderbilt, the duchess who inhabited its gilded halls, the cracks were becoming visible. They appeared not in the masonry of the palace itself, but in the fragile structure of her marriage, her role, and the world around her. By the early years of the 20th century, Consuelo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough was increasingly strained. The distance that had defined their union now widened into something irreparable. For years, she had carried the burden of duty, her spirit subdued beneath pearls and titles. But her awakening voice no longer allowed her to ignore the truth. The life she was living was neither sustainable nor just. The cracks in her private world mirrored the shifts in society at large. The Duke, Charles Sonny Spencer Churchill, had little interest in repairing the bond. His concerns remained fixed on politics, estate affairs, and his own pursuits. Rumors of extramarital affairs persisted, whispers that further corroded the thin thread of companionship between husband and wife. Consuelo, though dignified in silence, endured humiliation. Their public facade remained intact. At dinners, in portraits, at royal gatherings they appeared as a model aristocratic couple, but behind closed doors the marriage was a shell. For Consuelo, the cracks revealed themselves in moments of profound loneliness. She had 2 sons, John and Ivor, whom she loved dearly, but aristocratic custom distanced her from them. Tutors, governesses, and strict schedules often left her with little direct influence. The Duke's authority dictated even aspects of their upbringing, further eroding her sense of agency. She fulfilled a maternal role with devotion, but she could not escape the restrictions that kept her from being fully present in their lives. At the same time, the world beyond Blenheim was undergoing transformation. Britain was entering a new century, marked by political reform, social unrest, and the stirrings of women's rights movements. The suffrage cause gained visibility, and women were increasingly vocal in demanding equality. For Consuelo, who had long suppressed her own desires, these movements resonated deeply. Though she remained bound to her aristocratic duties, she recognized in these activists the courage to claim voices long silenced. Her philanthropic work became a bridge between her inner struggles and the broader world. She devoted energy to projects that aimed to improve housing for the poor, provide education for children, and support working women. These causes were not merely fashionable diversions, but lifelines. Through them, she discovered meaning beyond her marriage and began to carve an identity rooted in compassion rather than obligation. Yet even here, Cracks showed. The Duke's indifference toward her efforts underscored the gulf between them. What she valued, he dismissed. The growing incompatibility between them reached a point where the palace itself seemed to bear witness. Blenheim's grandeur no longer inspired her. It oppressed her. Its vast corridors echoed with silence, and its portraits of past dukes and duchesses seemed to mock her predicament. She was the latest in a line of women tied to legacy, yet unlike her predecessors, she yearned for something beyond survival. Letters and memoirs from contemporaries suggest that Consuelo began to confide more openly in trusted friends during this period. She admitted her unhappiness and spoke of a desire for independence. These confessions, though discreet, mark a significant shift. For a woman in her position, even acknowledging discontent was a quiet act of rebellion. The cracks in her life grew wider with each year. Her health, already fragile, suffered under the weight of stress and sorrow. She experienced illnesses that doctors often linked to nervous exhaustion, a term then used to describe the total emotional strain. Behind her composed appearance, she was weary, her body reflecting the burden of a broken spirit. Yet even as her marriage decayed, Consuelo remained resilient in public. She performed her duties, attended royal functions, and maintained the image demanded of her. But beneath the surface, she was preparing for change. Her awakening voice, nurtured in the quiet moments of philanthropy and reflection, pushed her toward the possibility of escape. By this time, her relationship with Sonny had become more formal than personal. They lived parallel lives under the same roof, partners in name but strangers in reality. Their children tied them together, as did the expectations of society, but the emotional bond had long since dissolved. For Consuelo, the cracks were no longer subtle. There were fissures threatening to break open. The irony of her situation was stark. She lived in one of the greatest houses in Britain, surrounded by wealth, status, and influence, yet she was profoundly unfree. Her pearls, her title, her position, all the emblems of success, had become the very symbols of her entrapment. The cracks in her palace walls were not floors of stone but of spirit, reminders that no amount of grandeur could mask the absence of love and autonomy. These years marked a turning point. For the first time, Consuelo began to see her future not as a continuation of her current life, but as something that could be changed. The cracks that once threatened to break her became the openings through which light could enter. In time, they would widen into the path of her escape. But at this stage, she remained within the palace, her voice growing stronger, her awareness sharper, her determination quietly taking root. The cracks in Blenheim's symbolic walls foreshadowed not ruin but transformation, the beginning of the end of a gilded imprisonment and the start of a reclamation. The world saw Consuelo Vanderbilt as a duchess defined by pearls, titles, and the grandeur of Blenheim Palace. Yet by the early years of the 20th century, she was preparing for something few would have dared to imagine, an escape. After years of endurance, of fulfilling duties imposed by her mother, her husband, and society, Consuelo reached a breaking point. The cracks in her marriage had widened into chasms, and the quiet awakening of her voice transformed into a determination to reclaim her life. For much of her marriage, Consuelo had been bound by appearances. Divorce or separation carried enormous stigma in aristocratic circles, especially for women. The Church of England frowned upon it, and society whispered cruelly about women who left their husbands, regardless of the reasons. To break free from Sonny, the Duke of Marlborough, meant scandal, risk, and the possible loss of everything she had been taught to value. Yet for Consuelo, remaining meant the slow erosion of her spirit. The decision to leave was not made lightly. Years of unhappiness, indifference, and cold formality with Sonny weighed heavily. Their marriage, already fractured, offered her no companionship or affection. While he pursued politics and his own interests, she lived in isolation. Even the presence of her sons, John and Ivor, could not heal the void, for aristocratic custom limited her role in their upbringing. Consuelo loved them fiercely, but she knew that staying in a hollow marriage would not serve them or herself. Her growing involvement in philanthropy and reform deepened her sense of independence. She worked closely with housing reformers and supported initiatives to improve living conditions for the poor. These experiences showed her that a woman's work could not be confined to titles or appearances. The more she stepped into this role, the more she realized that she had the courage to step out of the shadow of Blenheim. The escape itself began as quiet negotiations rather than dramatic gestures. Discussions between Consuelo and Sonny eventually led to an agreement, a separation that, though unconventional, allowed her some freedom. It was not without conflict. Sonny resisted at first, mindful of reputation and duty, but the irretrievable state of their marriage became undeniable. Over time, their estrangement was formalized, though divorce would come only later, once social attitudes had shifted further. For Consuelo, the moment of leaving Blenheim was both heartbreaking and liberating. She had spent years in its halls, fulfilling her role with dignity despite her suffering. To walk away from it meant relinquishing the identity she had been forced to adopt as the Duchess of Marlborough. Yet it also meant reclaiming the identity she had lost. Consuelo, a woman with her own voice, her own choices, her own future. Her departure was met with whispers in society. Some criticized her, casting her as ungrateful for abandoning a position others envied. Others sympathized, recognizing the courage it took for a woman of her standing to defy expectation. Newspapers speculated about her personal life, hinting at her affection for men who had treated her with kindness, though Consuelo herself maintained dignity and discretion. The true significance of her escape, however, lay not in scandal but in survival. She had endured a marriage arranged by ambition, a union sustained by appearances, and a life overshadowed by duty. Now, at last, she chose herself. In the years that followed, Consuelo's life transformed. She continued her charitable work with greater freedom, dedicating herself to causes that mattered deeply to her. She also experienced love on her own terms, forming relationships that gave her the affection denied in her marriage. Though society judged, she discovered fulfillment beyond its rigid expectations. Her sons remained central to her heart. Though separated from Blenheim, she maintained a bond with them, striving to give them the maternal presence she had once been denied. The courage she displayed in leaving set an example, not of rebellion without cause, but of strength born from necessity. The great escape was not merely the end of a marriage. It was the end of a life dictated entirely by others, and the beginning of one shaped by her own choices. For Consuelo, the act of leaving Blenheim was as symbolic as it was practical. The palace, once a prison, became a memory. The pearls, once chains, became reminders of resilience. The voice, once silenced, now spoke with clarity. In the broader story of the Gilded Age, Consuelo's escape revealed the limits of wealth and titles. Her mother's ambition had purchased her a crown, but it could not buy happiness. The Duke had secured his estate, but he had lost his wife. The world had witnessed a union of fortune and ability, only to see it unravel. And in that unraveling, Consuelo Vanderbilt redefined what it meant to be a duchess, not by staying bound, but by breaking free. Her escape did not end the struggles of her life, but it gave her the freedom to face them as herself. For the first time, she was no longer just a symbol of the dollar princess phenomenon. She was a woman who had endured the weight of pearls and palaces and found the strength to walk away.
When Consuelo Vanderbilt walked away from Blenheim Palace, she did not step immediately into peace or certainty. Separation brought freedom, yes, but also turbulence. The world she entered was one still dominated by rigid rules for women, and her name remained entangled with scandal, whispers, and society's relentless gaze. Yet slowly, deliberately, she began to weave a new life, one reclaimed from the ruins of the past. The first steps toward independence. In the early months after her separation, Consuelo felt both lighter and vulnerable. She had traded the gilded cage of Blenheim for an existence defined by her own choices, but choices that now required her to stand alone. For the first time since her girlhood, she had no dominating figure, no mother dictating her every step, no husband enforcing duty. That space of independence, though frightening, allowed her to ask, "Who am I, if not a duchess bound to a palace?" Her first answer came through philanthropy. Consuelo threw herself even more deeply into causes she had long supported, especially housing reform and the welfare of women and children. She had seen firsthand the grim realities of poverty in London, and unlike many aristocratic women, her involvement was not merely ceremonial. She visited crowded slums, met working-class families, and used her influence to draw attention to their struggles. Her wealth and position gave her a platform, but her compassion gave her credibility. Through these efforts, Consuelo discovered something Blenheim had denied her: purpose. Her days were no longer filled with empty rituals or the cold silences of her marriage. Instead, they brimmed with the knowledge that she was making a tangible difference. For once, she was not playing a role in someone else's design. She was living out her own convictions. A new kind of love. Alongside her public life came the stirrings of private happiness. While still married in name, Consuelo developed close friendships that blossomed into affection. Chief among these was Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and industrialist who had long admired her. Balsan was everything Sunny had not been: warm, supportive, and genuinely devoted. Jacques treated Consuelo as an equal, not as an ornament. He respected her intellect, encouraged her philanthropic endeavors, and offered her companionship without conditions. Their relationship developed cautiously, shadowed at first by propriety and the lingering ties of her marriage. Yet as the years passed and her separation became permanent, Jacques became a constant presence in her life, a source of joy where once there had been only resignation. With him, Consuelo began to experience love as choice rather than obligation. It was not the calculated union engineered by her mother, but a bond that grew naturally out of mutual respect and affection. In Jacques, she found not just romance, but partnership, the kind she had once believed impossible. Rebuilding her identity. Though she had left Blenheim, Consuelo remained the Duchess of Marlborough in title. That identity could not be stripped from her, nor could the expectations attached to it. Yet she consciously worked to redefine herself, not as a symbol of wealth or status, but as a woman with her own narrative. She traveled, wrote, and immersed herself in cultural life. Europe offered her new vistas, from the salons of Paris to the coasts of the Mediterranean, and she embraced them with curiosity. These travels were more than leisure. They were explorations of self. Each new horizon reminded her that her life need not be confined to the rigid traditions of English aristocracy. Consuelo also deepened her ties with her sons. Though custom dictated much of their upbringing at Blenheim, she remained a devoted mother, seeking to provide them with emotional grounding that had been absent from her own childhood. Letters, visits, and shared moments built a bond that endured distance. Her sons knew her love, and in time they came to respect the choices she had made. Facing society's judgment. Even as she flourished in her new life, Consuelo could not entirely escape the judgment of the world she had left behind. Aristocratic society, particularly in England, remained unforgiving of women who broke convention. Her separation was a subject of gossip, her affection for Jacques whispered about in drawing rooms. Yet Consuelo bore it with quiet dignity. She did not lash out at Sunny in public or seek to justify herself endlessly. Instead, she allowed her actions to speak. Her philanthropy, her grace in the face of scandal, and her steady devotion to her sons gradually softened criticism. Over time, she even developed a cordial relationship with Sunny, recognizing that bitterness would serve neither of them nor their children. This maturity marked another step in reclaiming her life. She was no longer the frightened girl forced into a loveless marriage, nor the silenced duchess trapped in ceremony. She was a woman capable of facing judgment without bending beneath it. Toward a second marriage. The final act of reclaiming came with the eventual formal dissolution of her marriage. By the 1920s, divorce had become less scandalous, though still controversial in aristocratic circles. For Consuelo, the legal severing of her ties to Sunny was not just a formality, it was the symbolic completion of her escape. Soon after, she married Jacques Balsan. Their union, in stark contrast to her first, was born of affection, respect, and choice. Together, they built a life rich in companionship. With Jacques, Consuelo experienced the partnership she had once only dreamed of. They divided their time between Europe and America, enjoying both public life and private retreats. This marriage was not about palaces or titles, it was about happiness. For Consuelo, it represented the triumph of her will over the chains that had once bound her. A legacy of strength. By reclaiming her life, Consuelo also reshaped the legacy of her story. To many, she would always be remembered as the dollar princess whose fortune propped up Blenheim Palace. But her true legacy lay in the courage to walk away, to redefine herself, and to live authentically despite the weight of expectation. In her later years, she recorded her memories in her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. The book revealed her story with candor, stripping away the myths that had long surrounded her. She spoke not as a duchess clinging to grandeur, but as a woman reflecting honestly on triumphs and regrets. Her voice, once silenced by her mother and her husband, finally rang clear across the decades. Closing reflection. Reclaiming her life was not a single moment, but a journey of leaving Blenheim, of finding love, of discovering purpose, and of building an identity beyond pearls and titles. In that journey, Consuelo Vanderbilt became more than a duchess, more than a symbol of Gilded Age ambition. She became a testament to resilience. The young girl forced into a gilded cage grew into a woman who unlocked its door and stepped into the world on her own terms. She proved that even within the strict confines of society, a woman could rewrite her story. For every whisper of scandal, there was a louder truth. Consuelo had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she had won something no palace or fortune could ever provide: herself.
When Consuelo Vanderbilt sat down to write her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, she was no longer the trembling young bride forced into a palace, nor the duchess who once embodied the ambitions of the Gilded Age. She was an older woman, seasoned by decades of triumphs and wounds, living with a perspective that only time and distance could provide. For the first time, she was free to tell a story in her own words, a voice unbound. The act of writing was, for Consuelo, an act of liberation. Throughout her youth and much of her adulthood, others had spoken for her. Alva Vanderbilt had dictated her future. Sunny Marlborough had demanded silence, and society had crafted its own myths around her. With pen in hand, she broke that silence. Her memoir was not simply a recounting of glittering banquets and titled acquaintances. It was a revelation of the woman behind the jewels and palaces. She described the suffocating control of her mother, the cold emptiness of Blenheim, and the personal sacrifices demanded by duty. For readers accustomed to romanticized visions of duchesses and duller princesses, her honesty was startling. Through her words, she reclaimed not only her story but also her dignity. She revealed the truth of an era gilded on the surface but riddled with cracks beneath. The purpose of memory. Consuelo's memoir was not written to indulge in bitterness. Instead, it carried the reflective tone of someone who had endured pain but also learned from it. She was candid about her regrets, her inability to resist a mother's will, her years of silence, the toll of her choices, but she was also generous in acknowledging the complexities of the people around her. Alva, for all her iron will, was portrayed as a woman shaped by her own insecurities and ambitions. Sonny, though cold and domineering, was shown as a man burdened by duty and legacy. Even the rigid society that had trapped her was not reduced to caricature but painted as a system of pressures and expectations. This fairness gave her memoir a rare depth. She was not seeking revenge. She was offering testimony. It was a record not only of her life but of a generation of women caught between tradition and change, capturing an era. The glitter and the gold did more than recount Consuelo's personal journey. It preserved the atmosphere of the Gilded Age and the fading world of European aristocracy. Through her eyes, readers glimpsed the opulence of Vanderbilt mansions, the grandeur of Blenheim, and the rituals of society obsessed with appearances, yet interwoven with descriptions of jewels, gowns, and ceremonies was a subtle critique. Consuelo's narrative exposed the hollowness behind the spectacle, the loneliness of vast halls, the emptiness of arranged unions, the way women's lives were bartered for titles and alliances. Her memoir became a mirror held up to history, reflecting both its splendor and its flaws. For modern readers, it offered insight into a world both dazzling and destructive, reception and impact. When published, The Glitter and the Gold drew wide attention. Society readers were captivated by its revelations, historians intrigued by its detail, and women inspired by its candor. At a time when many still viewed aristocracy through a lens of glamour, Consuelo's memoir provided a counterpoint, an insider's testimony of the cost of privilege. Critics praised her voice, measured, dignified, and truthful. She neither exaggerated her suffering nor diminished her joys. Instead, she offered a balanced account, one that resonated with authenticity. For younger women especially, her story was a warning and an encouragement, the warning of what submission to societal pressure could cost, and the encouragement that reclamation was always possible. The book also solidified her legacy. No longer would she be remembered solely as a duller princess who saved Blenheim. She would be remembered as a woman who dared to tell the truth about it. Reflection on love and renewal. In her memoir, Consuelo also spoke of renewal. She acknowledged the happiness she had found later in life with Jacques Balsan. Their marriage, based on affection and equality, stood as proof that love could be real even after years of duty and sacrifice. This chapter of her story balanced the earlier tales of oppression. It showed that freedom, though delayed, was not denied. It reminded readers that personal happiness was possible even in lives shaped by public expectation. The weight of telling one's story. To write memoir is to wrestle with memory, with what to reveal, what to omit, and how to frame the past. For Consuelo, the weight of truth was heavy, but necessary. She had spent decades defined by others. Now she defined herself. Her candor also came with risk. By exposing the dynamics of her family and marriage, she opened herself to scrutiny. But the act of truth-telling itself was her triumph. It was proof that she was no longer the silent duchess. She was a woman with a voice, and she would use it. Closing reflection. In the end, The Glitter and the Gold was more than a memoir. It was a reclamation. Through its pages, Consuelo Vanderbilt ensured that history would remember not just her jewels, her titles, or her palaces, but her humanity. She transformed from a symbol into a storyteller. Her life, once dictated by others, became a narrative crafted by her own hand. And in doing so, she gave future generations not only a window into the past, but a model of resilience and truth. The Duchess, who had once been trapped in a gilded cage, now spoke freely, her words echoing long after the palaces had dimmed. Consuelo Vanderbilt's life was often described in terms of wealth, beauty, and titles. She was a daughter of America's richest family, married into Britain's most prestigious dukedom, and adorned with pearls, gowns, and palaces that dazzled onlookers. But beneath the sparkle of a public image lay a profound truth. Every jewel, every palace, every aristocratic title came with a cost. Her story was not only about grandeur, but about the sacrifices demanded to sustain it, the price of pearls and palaces, the bargain of the Gilded Age. Consuelo's childhood had been shaped by the ambitions of the Gilded Age, when wealthy American families sought to legitimize their fortunes through marriages into European nobility. For the Vanderbilts, whose immense railroad wealth lacked Old World pedigree, a duchess and the family meant entry into the highest echelons of society. The bargain was clear: money for titles. The Vanderbilt millions restored Blenheim Palace, saved the Marlborough legacy, and secured Alva's vision of aristocratic recognition. But for Consuelo, the price was her freedom. She was not asked to choose, but ordered to obey. Her pearls, which symbolized privilege to the world, were to her chains, binding her to a marriage she did not want. This was the unspoken truth of the dollar princess phenomenon. Behind every glittering wedding was a woman sacrificed to ambition, the toll on the individual. At Blenheim, the cost of that bargain became evident. Consuelo's daily life was not one of romance or joy, but of duty and display. She filled her role flawlessly, hosting dignitaries, bearing knaves, and upholding the image of grandeur. Yet beneath the surface, her spirit waned. The pearls she wore at ceremonies sparkled under candlelight, but each strand reminded her of the life denied to her. The palace, admired by visitors as a marvel of architecture, became for her a prison of stone. The very symbols of her family's triumph became instruments of her confinement. Her sacrifice was not merely personal. It reflected the limited agency of women in her era. Wealth and status offered no immunity from subjugation. If anything, they heightened it. For daughters like Consuelo, gilded cages were confining as the humblest restrictions, a broader reflection on society. The price Consuelo paid was not hers alone. Her story mirrored that of many women of a generation, daughters traded in transatlantic marriages, bound to men they did not love, forced to prioritize duty over desire. It also mirrored the cost of an entire system built on appearances. The Vanderbilt fortune, like others of the Gilded Age, purchased symbols of legitimacy, but these symbols rarely brought happiness. Families gained prestige but lost daughters. Palaces were preserved, but at the expense of individual lives. The glittering facade concealed the fractures within. Consuelo's memoirs later made this cost visible. She gave voice to the silenced experiences of her peers, reminding the world that beneath the gold was struggle. The turning point. In walking away from her marriage, Consuelo refused to pay the price any longer. It was an act of defiance not just against Sonny Marlborough, but against the entire system that had forced her into the Union. By reclaiming her life, she demonstrated that even within the rigid structures of her age, agency was possible. Yet even her escape carried a price. She endured public gossip, the strain of separation from her children, and years of rebuilding her reputation. Freedom was never simple. It required courage and sacrifice of a different kind. Redemption through truth. Consuelo's later years, spent in love with Jacques Balsan and in devotion to philanthropy, showed that the price of pearls and palaces could be redeemed. Though her youth had been sacrificed, her maturity was reclaimed. She found purpose in helping others, companionship in true affection, and peace in honesty. Her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, became the final expression of this redemption. By telling the truth, she ensured that her story would not be remembered only for its glamour but for its lessons. She revealed the cost of ambition, the resilience of the human spirit, and the possibility of renewal. The lasting legacy. Today, Consuelo's name is inseparable from Blenheim Palace and the Vanderbilt fortune, but her legacy is far greater. She stands as a symbol of resilience against the crushing weight of duty. She embodies the human cost of the Gilded Age dream, but also the courage to reclaim one's life. The pearls that once symbolized her captivity became, in retrospect, symbols of endurance. The palaces that once imprisoned her became monuments not just to grandeur but to the sacrifices hidden within their walls. Her story endures because it speaks to a universal truth. Wealth and status cannot guarantee happiness. True freedom lies not in jewels or titles, but in the courage to choose one's own path. Closing reflection. The price of pearls and palaces was steep, and Consuelo Vanderbilt paid it with her youth, her freedom, and years of unhappiness. Yet she also reclaimed much: her voice, her dignity, and her legacy. Her life reminds us that beneath every glittering facade, there is a human story, often complex, often painful, but always worth hearing. The pearls and palaces dazzled the world, but it was Consuelo's truth that endured, shining brighter than any jewel.